Hello and welcome to the Aviation Briefing, a brand new podcast hosted by me, William Hallowell. In this series, I'll be diving into some of the biggest topics in the aviation industry, tackling them head-on with a variety of industry guests and media colleagues. For those of you who don't know me, I am heading up the Airside International magazine published by EVA. And in this exciting first episode, I'm joined with Ivan Stevenson, Associate Professor and Curriculum Lead for Aviation Management at Coventry University. Hello, Ivan.
Hello, William. Hi, great to be with you today.
It's great to have you. In this first inaugural episode, we're going to be talking about sustainable aviation fuel, which is obviously quite a big topic in the industry at the moment, particularly in light of very new events in the last few weeks. And obviously we've got COP28 going on, and in general, sustainability's a huge topic in aviation at the moment.
Is, yeah.
It often gets the blame for a lot of carbon emissions and those sorts of things. So let's start with recent events when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel. At the end of November, we had the first 100% SAF-powered transatlantic flight by Virgin Atlantic, which was hailed by the industry as being a milestone, certainly a case study to show what can be done when it comes to looking for more sustainable fuels and flying. But some people say that it's not as sustainable as the industry claims. And I know you're one of those people. So let's talk about it, because it certainly is interesting. So tell me.
Yeah, so I mean, it's interesting. You kind of suggested that I'm one of those people that perhaps don't think it's maybe as quite as sustainable as the industry would like us to think it is, and I don't think I'm necessarily alone in that. Certainly, when you talk to academics on the kind of policy sort of side of the issue, I think there is a general consensus that we shouldn't delude ourselves into thinking that sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF as it's known, is a secret or an easy way towards achieving zero aviation or zero emissions aviation. And in fact, I mean, whilst the term zero emissions aviation, or zero or avia, or whatever we want to call it, is an interesting concept, and it's probably something that we should be aspiring to. Sustainable aviation fuel is not zero emissions aviation fuel. And then the reality is we are a long way from that as an industry sector. In terms of getting there, we're really looking to the next generation of propulsion, and really the next generation of propulsion, particularly to be able to serve the kind of long haul routes that the Virgin Flight 100 was kind of looking at, or was fueling. We're looking at a good maybe 15, 20, possibly even 30 years away, depending on how quickly the technology, we're talking, advanced electrical, probably more likely hydrogen propulsion, until that really emerges. So not to kind of, maybe denigrate it entirely, what happened a couple of weeks ago was certainly a really significant step. But, there are bigger challenges that need to be overcome before we reach a point where sustainable aviation fuel is producible in the volumes and quantities that are required to fuel and power the aviation industry. And I mean, the other points I think that some other commentators have kind of picked up as well is that if we're going to look at producing sustainable aviation fuel from bio sources, you're potentially looking at, again, phenomenal takeover of land space for the production of crops. And I'm not an environmental campaigner by any stretch of the imagination, but you look at countries like Brazil, where rainforest has kind of been depleted to grow crops to sustain farm life, for animals, for meat production, etc. And of course, you then go down sort of the rabbit hole of the deeper, darker issues associated with environmental activism, etc. And we can't deny that these issues are not interconnected. They absolutely are. The question is, how do we talk about them honestly, frankly, but constructively, to try and have honest, frank, and open debate? and then look at really where we go and what we do next. There's no easy answers here, by the way. I don't pretend to come here with any magical solution. I don't know anyone who does, but yeah, it's important we talk about them.
No, exactly. One thing I will say, when I said those people, I didn't mean to put a target on your back in any sense at all. I just meant, there are skeptics who, will say that, look, the aviation industry is doing what it can to kind of reduce emissions and look for more sustainable solutions. But at the same time, are they as green as, the industry claims? And, if I were to speak to any kind of major airline representative, they'll give me a very different answer.
Yes.
To other people and environmental campaigners as well. I know you say you're not an environmental campaigner, but I did speak to a number kind of off the back of Flight 100 at the end of November, and they said exactly that look, it's going to cost so much financially, as well as the kind of land that would need to be scaled to upscale the production of SAF. It certainly is interesting, but I mean, what is the solution? Because there are those kind of more kind of hardline environmental campaigners who actually have turned around and said, well, SAF isn't sustainable at all. But then, if it isn't, what's the solution then? Are we going to be looking at more hydrogen than other things like biofuels?
Yes, I mean, I think I've sort of talked before about there are technological solutions, there are policy solutions, and there are econometric solutions. And I mean, I've always said, and other academics would agree, the aviation industry certainly doesn't like to talk about econometric solutions, because essentially you're talking about ways of dampening demand. And I understand why, from a business perspective, you're not going to want to do that. And there are debates about the accessibility. If you increase transportation cost by air, it's not democratic. You are preventing accessibility to something that rich people would find pleasurable, the ability to travel. And why should people on lower incomes not be able to do that? But the reality of that is there's a bit of a kind of a hidden point here, in that we talk about the low-cost revolution having opened up demand, etc. It certainly did that and is doing that. And where we see economic growth around the world, we see low-cost airlines moving in and picking up that demand as middle incomes grow and people have discretionary income to spend on travel. But the reality is that still people on the lowest of income still are not able to access travel by air. What really happens is that it's simply more of the middle classes simply travel more. So there is a debate there that I think we really need to engage in terms of the right to travel and where and how, etc. And should we really be looking at more sustainable methods of travel? For example, should we be looking more at investment in high-speed rail and possibly more integration with high-speed rail with air transportation, possibly on short to maybe more medium-haul routes? I think we established intercontinental flying is not going to, there is no easy solution to that, to making it more sustainable. So the other side, as I talked about, the econometric issue, or the econometric measures to dampen demand, but then actually the technological solutions around, sustainable fuel. We do need that, and arguably that's about government policy and promoting or kind of facilitating the right forms of investment into creating the right type of fuel, creating the right kind of growth for that industry sector. But then also there is the technological issue around the next generation of propulsion. And I mean, I'm not an engineer. I mean, I work in an engineering faculty and I have engineering colleagues, but I'm not an engineer. My understanding of what's happening that side is really rather limited. But there is, I mean, it's interesting, the autumn statement from the UK Chancellor of the Exchequer a few weeks ago, really did announce some significant investment levels in advanced manufacturing in the UK, and a significant amount of that was geared towards aerospace. And the UK does lead in certain areas of aerospace and aerospace technological development. We've got companies in this country like Rolls-Royce, for example, a well-established engine manufacturer. In fact, the university here is built upon partly some of the old Rolls-Royce sort of estate here in Coventry. So we've got that legacy here. But advanced propulsion is certainly, we need more investment in that, possibly to try and get there a bit quicker. I know that if you talk to, I've heard them speak, sort of the leaders, CEOs at EasyJet and Loganair, two very different airlines, with very, very different, markets that they serve, but they've got slightly different views really in terms of what's coming first. And, so you've got a focus, a belief that maybe hydrogen will be first, maybe a focus on developing more advanced electrical aircraft. The jury's out which will be first, which is going to be better. But then, of course, really, really long haul airlines like, sort of the big flag carriers, BA, it's not a flag carrier anymore, but Virgin Atlantic, etc. They're really looking at sustainable aviation fuel because their future, unless we can ramp up, speed up, and get to more advanced methods of propulsion, SAF is really the way to go. But we need to deal with that issue about demand. It's not just about the demand for air transportation and emissions. It's also then the interconnection between air transportation and tourism, and the impact that tourism has on its destinations. And yes, we talk about sustainable tourism and ecotourism and all of that, but the reality is over-tourism is a phenomenon. And you look, for example, in our Mediterranean holiday destinations, from Barcelona to Mallorca, picking the Spanish resorts, and we've seen that pressure grow in terms of the anti-tourist or the anti-mass tourist movement. And I was in Mallorca a few years ago, walking around the streets of Palma, a beautiful city, a lovely place. I love to go there.
It is, yeah.
But to see that scrolling, tourists go home. And maybe not written in such polite language either. There is that kind of pressure on resorts, and Mallorca, as a destination, have really now, again, their internal policy has begun to shift towards trying to press down on mass tourism and trying to press down on particular types of mass tourism. Certain resorts like, Magaluf and Arenal, well known for particular types of behaviors, shall we say. There's real local pressure there to kind of change those resorts, and they're trying to shift away more to a different type of, they argue that it's from a higher quality tourism. But again, that goes back to that discussion about who should be able to access tourism. Is it only for, particular income brackets or particular types of people? It raises that debate about equality and accessibility and democratic participation. So, yeah, I told you I wasn't going to bring answers. It's supposed to be an academic, eh?
It's interesting because, I've had similar discussions talking about, look, when it comes to bringing it back to SAF, kind of in particular, like you say, it's really important for those long haul carriers to get underway and enable these developments, because they need to in order to survive. But one thing, I think, from a UK perspective, the government will certainly say that, they're investing a lot, they're constantly kind of giving out new grants, new funding. And I've spoken to a number of UK-based SAF producers, and that's what they want. What they're calling on the government to do is invest in not just them, but the actual infrastructure and the projects to actually help facilitate the technology, but also upscaling, the quantity of SAF being produced. Yes. One thing I do kind of want to go back to when we talk about Flight 100 and Virgin Atlantic's flight in November, going back again to what climate campaigners were saying, they were saying that, yes, okay, it looks great on paper, but it by no means is a demonstration, is a case study to say, look, we can roll this out industry-wide. What would you kind of make of that, kind of assessment?
As in the challenge of rolling it out industry wide, I have to say that I think that point is indisputable, given where we are at the moment. I mean, it's all about degrees, as in degrees of impact. What is the aspiration here? We're talking about, achieving net zero, 2030, 2040, 2050, 20 when, 20 never. And, are we talking about, a 2, 3, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25% reduction over what time frame? What are the targets? And in terms of what scaling up is required to achieve those targets, and do we have the land capacity? And again, what is the source of your fuel? Is it old cooking oil? Well, there's plenty of fast food restaurants around that probably dispose, gallons of the stuff, every day, every week. But that's not going to power, a major, long haul carrier for, a month, never mind a year. So we've got to then look at other forms. So we've got to then look at other bio means, and again, the significance, again, not to undermine it, but the significance of VS100 was, that was the first flight that was fueled by 100% sustainable aviation fuel. The current policy, is that the current practice, it's an add-in, it's a mix. So, it's 10, 20, 25%, whatever it is, of sustainable aviation fuel mixed with standard aviation, jet A1. So, what are we trying to get to? Where are we trying to get to, and when and how? And I mean, it was interesting. I was listening to the Transport Select Committee. They were talking a while ago about, the UK's general transportation policy and what the strategic objectives were. Now, the focus in that conversation was really much more about public transportation infrastructure and integrated policy on that side. I mean, it's not entirely disconnected from aviation, but one of the contributors to the Transport Select Committee discourse, Professor Annabel Gillian Annabel from Leeds, I mean, she pointed out that that there is no real coherence around transport policy, and there are no clearly coherent integrated transport objectives in the UK. And she pointed out, I agree with her, really, that when we talk about transport, we might break it down into discourse around sustainability and emissions, but actually there are other factors here that need to be considered as well, and it's to do with equality and accessibility, etc. But the other point was that with different modes of transportation, aviation, rail, road, etc., maritime, there are different policies from the department, but there's no linking together of these policies. There's no common ground, there's no common discourse, and that they change really quite suddenly, from year to year. So there's no long-term plan, no long-term strategy, no long-term objectives, never mind there being any kind of long-term integration of those objectives into a coherent transport policy. So if we start from that point, and people talk about sustainability, I mean, I talk about sustainable transportation almost on a daily basis. It's something that I have regular conversations with colleagues about, because it's something we have to deal with here. I work in the School of Future Transport Engineering here at Coventry. So, very much we're about an awful lot of this conversation, trying to progress it forward. My colleagues who are engineers, pushing this forward and developing engineers and managers and systems managers, for this future generation of transportation. But there's still an awful lot of what we're trying to grapple with that we still don't really know about. The industry still doesn't really fully understand a lot of this. We're trying to get ahead of something, but yet our knowledge development and our ability to grasp some of this stuff is still really quite, I don't want to use the word in its infancy, but we're certainly, we're toddling rather than walking confidently, never mind running. So there's an awful lot of bits that really need to try and come together to make this all really reach a point where it becomes meaningful and impactful. And I don't even know which bits are coming together, and I don't know who does. And maybe to jump ahead, I don't want to steal your points, but I mean, going back to you mentioned COP. Yeah, I don't know where we go with this. I don't know how we take it forward into a more constructive discourse, rather than people trying to fight their own little corner and kind of put up their own sort of agenda, so to speak, and defend their bit. We like to think in academia that that's what we're about. We're about trying to bring people together to try and have constructive discourse and constructive conversations and engage in knowledge development. But we do have our own serious disagreements as well, So yeah.
I suppose as well, I mean, do you think there's an element of there being this kind of race for individual governments to kind of show that they're being first to hit the mark when it comes to the targets, first to be, say they're producing this amount of SAF, hit their own targets, when there's the possibility that, I mean, I know we've kind of spoken about this before, there's the potential eventuality that the developing nations get left behind because they don't have the money, they don't have the infrastructure, they don't have the capacity to be producing SAF or getting involved in the same discussions to the same extent as Western Europe and Northern America are, for example.
That's a really, really good question. Are governments trying to be first? That's a very controversial question. I'm probably going to give a rather controversial answer.
Please do.
Yeah, I'll wait for my inbox to fill up. I'll find somewhere to hide. I think there is I think politically, politicians like to be seen to kind of, hit certain kind of narratives with the electorate. And of course, politicians are always sounding out, what it is they think their electorate wants and what the thing is that they need to say or be seen to be doing. But there is a difference between being seen to be doing and really doing and actually doing and having an impact. I mean, go back to my point about, transport. I mean, we don't have a coherent and cohesive transport policy. Maybe in the UK, we're moving towards that. But to bring it into aviation, I mean, the recent, that flight, the VS100 was an objective or an aim that was set out in the most recent kind of iteration of the government's, aviation development framework policy document published, I think it was 2022. So I mean, they can say, well, we've achieved this. We've done this. We're the first. The UK has helped facilitate the first 100%, sustainable aviation fuel flight. Wow, that's fantastic. What the meaning of it is in terms of longer term, I really don't know. So I think there is a sense in which governments, yes, want to be seen to be doing something. But to use that dirty word, can we accuse them of greenwashing? Yeah, I think we very possibly can. But then again, some people would say, aren't we all? I mean, I travel. I love to travel. I fly. I book my holidays, like many other people. So am I a hypocrite? Yeah, to some degrees, and to many people, yes, I very probably am. And in terms of individual behaviors versus government behavior, or government simply just mirroring what actually the electorate really we want. We want to be maybe told or maybe hear the right thing. Do we really, really want to really get to grips with and understand what the impact of our situation is and the impact of our behaviors? And research, unfortunately, does suggest that no, we don't. We don't really want to know. We're not really wanting to, face up to it. And especially when, with developed economies, people have achieved a particular standard of living. They want to maintain that. And we're in a situation where, well, people are probably, in many cases, I would suggest, not as willing to give up. They want to see environmental improvement. They want to see a sustainable future, but not at my expense. and that's controversial. There's no doubt about that, because then it raises questions about our own personal values, morals, ethics, and how we approach, the world. There is also a sense politically whereby, and I think, the UK government has been quite clear about this. Yes, we want a sustainable future, but certainly not at any economic price. We have to maintain, economic growth, and our economic models that we have generally on a global scale at the moment require that. To raise the question then about, developing economies, I would distinguish between developing economies possibly and emerging economies. Is China still an emerging economy? I think China is a fairly well established economy, and it continues to be so. I think we need to move it out of that bracket from emerging to, it is certainly trying to make a big impact, and probably will do. I strongly suspect that will continue to be so. And we've seen economic power shifting from west to east. When it will eventually take over, and if and when will it take over? But I mean, there is this kind of sense in which China are obviously a significant big polluter, along with India. These big economies are growing, and in order to grow, they've got to consume resources, and they produce emissions. Are they going to want to reduce? I mean, I think China do have a policy on reducing emissions, and they do have a policy on SAF. There is work going on there. It just is very much a case of we will do our way. It doesn't mean they're not doing it. It doesn't mean they don't realize it. Doesn't mean they're not engaging with it. But they're doing it their way, and there certainly isn't the same vocal public discourse around these issues in those economies. Is that because there isn't the same public awareness, education, discourse, etc., or is it just it's a different kind of different priorities, different ways of looking at things? And then, of course, the West, the established economies are not going to want to necessarily be giving into that. They're going to want to maintain their status. So it's a very difficult global balancing act, politically, socially, economically. It comes back to those fundamental things, and I guess that brings us back to where the way forward. And arguably, for all its faults, and for all of the challenges, the issues that COP28 has thrown up, it is currently really the only international global forum where there can be any kind of real discourse, discussion on this issue. As to its effectiveness, finding a global consensus on anything is next to impossible. So I think anything comes out of COP is arguably progress, because there's nowhere else. And that ultimately will feed down into industry pressures and industry and policy. So you've got that balance between policy at a global, policy at a regional, policy at a national level, and then you have the nature of the economy and consumer expectations and demands, and what people expect and want from their lives, and where that all intersects is very messy.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, do you know what? You've made a lot of points. I've been trying to keep up with them. One thing I suppose then is, I think a big takeaway from what you've just said is, you were kind of talking earlier on about collaboration and the need for collaboration across the industry, but it seems to me that your view is that national politics and geopolitics is kind of a huge, I don't want to use the word barrier because it sounds very negative in connotation, but it almost does seem that geopolitics does prevent international collaboration, and I suppose that's what a lot of industry leaders want. It's supposed to be, when you talk about COP as well, and that was kind of going to be one of the things that I wanted to mention was, there's a lot of skepticism around these kind of events, and a lot of skeptics will say, look, is COP really an effective tool, or is that in itself, a greenwashing exercise? And I know that you've said you've been following what's been happening with COP. So in terms of this year, because it does kind of seem that every year it happens, it's in the press for a couple of weeks, and then it kind of just dies down, and then we don't see any follow-up in terms of the commitments that have been made by governments. So what's kind of your assessment with regard to decarbonisation in the aviation industry based on what you've kind of seen so far?
Well, I think it's interesting that some of the discourse of the reporting around COP28, that the hosting nation was seeking to have backroom deals, around the access to sales of fossil fuels, which to my understanding they never denied. They certainly tried to kind of deflect from it, but I'm not sure that a denial that was happening was ever really forthcoming. And the deflection was along the lines of, you're trying to, sort of take away from what we're doing here and what we're trying to achieve. I think the next most significant point was the conversation around, a global commitment to, removing use of fossil fuels from our societies, from our industry, and whether we will ultimately get there. I mean, that ultimately, I think, is what needs to happen if we're going to be really serious about driving forward towards, if we talk about a sustainable aviation future, or a zero emissions future, all those things I meant, the econometric pressures, the technological solutions, the move towards, new methods of propulsion, et cetera, arguably, yes, a global commitment to remove fossil fuels from use would arguably create an incentive to try and drive forward some of those other measures. How realistic is it? Well, I mean, it comes back to the thing about, well, what do we need? There's a lot of things that we depend upon fuel for, and it's not just fueling, aircraft or anything else. Petrochemicals are involved in many areas of our lives. So we need to kind of think about what do we replace some of those other things with as well. It's a much bigger environmental debate. But I think, I think COP is the only, as I said before, it's the only place on a global scale where these issues are actually debated and discussed. So, do you know what? It's like everything else. It's not perfect, but it's what we have at this point in time. And geopolitical politics being a barrier, but that's just life. That's the reality of where we're at. We live on a really quite small planet, in a very, very vast, cosmos. And this is the only home we have. There is nowhere else. And we have to find a way. And, those, as I said, my starting point, this has always been, there is no easy answer to this. But this is very much about trying to have conversations, and I think there is a sense socially, and again, it's come back to where we've been in the last kind of 5-10 years. There is a difficulty in having conversations. People find it very difficult to sit down and have direct, honest conversations without getting very upset and without getting a little bit too emotional sometimes, and taking it all really rather personally. And I think we've lost that art as people, and asking politicians then to do it for us is quite an ask as well. But the imperfections of what we have doesn't mean that we should stop trying.
Well, look, we've covered a lot of subjects, and I wish we had more time to kind of delve into them more. So I can only apologize for that. But look, Ivan Stevenson, thank you very much for joining me for the very first episode of the Aviation Briefing. So thank you very much.
Thank you, William. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.